The smoke-filled cantina on Nexus Station buzzed with nervous chatter. Commander Zexhai of the Corvin Empire sat hunched over his drink, his battle-scarred carapace telling stories of 100 conflicts across the galaxy. The young officers around him wore pristine uniforms, their eyes bright, with the foolish confidence of those who had never faced real war. "Tell us about the humans again, Commander," urged Lieutenant Veltar, barely old enough to hold his first plasma rifle. "The stories can't all be true." Zexhai's compound eyes darkened as he lifted his glass with one of his forearms. The artificial gravity made the liquid swirl in patterns that reminded him of blood spiraling down a drain. He had seen too much of that particular sight. "You want to know about humans?" Zexhai's voice carried the weight of experience that had cost him 3 of his original 6 limbs. "Then, listen carefully, because your life may depend on understanding what I'm about to tell you." The younger officers leaned in, their excitement palpable. They had heard whispers about the mysterious species from Sol 3, but official reports were classified above their clearance levels. What they knew came from rumors and half-told tales in places like this. "I fought in the Centauri campaign," Zexhai began, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 12 species united against what we thought was just another primitive world. Earth, they called it. We had energy weapons, faster than light travel, genetic engineering. They had chemical rockets and metal projectiles. "That doesn't sound very threatening," scoffed another young officer, his green skin flushed with alcohol. Zexhai's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile if his species possessed such expressions. "That's exactly what we thought. The intelligence reports showed a divided planet, constantly at war with itself. We expected easy conquest, maybe some entertaining resistance before they surrendered." The commander paused, taking another drink before continuing. His remaining arm trembled slightly, a war wound that never fully healed. "The first engagement was over their 4th planet, Mars. Our fleet of 200 vessels against maybe 30 of their crewed ships. We opened fire at maximum range, expecting to vaporize them instantly." The cantina had grown quieter as other patrons strained to hear the veteran's words. Stories about humans were rare, and first-hand accounts even rarer. But something was wrong from the start. Instead of fleeing or trying to negotiate, they charged straight at us. Not tactical maneuvering, not defensive formations. They came at our superior force like a pack of hunting beasts that had caught a scent. Zexhai's eyes reflected the dim lighting of the cantina, making them appear to glow with an inner fire. Their ships were built differently than ours. Where we had comfortable crew quarters and recreational areas, they had packed in more weapons, more armor, more ammunition. Every inch of space was dedicated to war. "But surely your superior technology," one of the listeners began. "Technology means nothing if you're not willing to use it to its fullest extent," Zexhai interrupted harshly. "We fired our weapons, then waited for them to recharge. Standard military doctrine across the galaxy. Fire, pause, assess, fire again." The veteran stood up slowly, his prosthetic leg making a soft whirring sound. He walked to the cantina's large viewport, staring out at the stars where countless species traveled in relative peace. "Humans don't pause. They don't assess. They fire everything they have, ram their damaged ships into yours when their weapons fail, and when their ships are destroyed, they put on pressure suits and continue fighting with handheld weapons in the vacuum of space." The young officers exchanged uncertain glances. This couldn't be true. No species was that reckless, that willing to throw away their lives. I watched a human pilot with a severed arm use his remaining hand to steer his crippled fighter directly into our command ship's bridge. The explosion killed everyone on the command deck, including Admiral Thekmore. The pilot knew it was suicide, but he smiled as he died. I saw his face through my scope. Zexhai turned back to face his audience, his expression grim. That's when I began to understand. Every other species in the galaxy evolved to survive. We developed intelligence to avoid dangers, technology to overcome obstacles, cooperation to build civilizations. We learned that survival meant knowing when to fight and when to flee. Humans evolved to hunt. They're persistent predators who chased their prey across entire continents until it collapsed from exhaustion. When they couldn't outrun something, they threw sharpened sticks at it until it died. When they couldn't overpower something, they worked in groups to surround it and tear it apart. The cantina had fallen completely silent now, even the background music seeming to fade away. And now they've taken that hunting instinct to the stars. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Lieutenant Veltar found his voice again. But, Commander, surely once they realized they were outmatched, they must have sought peace talks. Every intelligent species does that. Zexhai let out a sound that might have been laughter, but held no humor. Outmatched. Young fool, you still don't understand. After that first battle at Mars, we had lost 30 ships to their 4. Our survivors reported impossible maneuvers, weapons pushed far beyond safe parameters, and tactics that defied every military manual in the galaxy. The veteran returned to his seat, his prosthetic leg hissing as it adjusted to his weight. The High Command was furious. They couldn't accept that primitive humans had hurt us so badly, so they sent me with the Second Fleet. 500 ships this time, the largest military force the Corvin Empire had ever assembled. That should have been enough to overwhelm them completely, whispered another officer. It should have been. But humans don't think like us. While we were gathering our forces and planning our grand assault, they were doing what predators do best. They were hunting. Zexhai's remaining hand clenched around his glass hard enough that the material began to crack. 3 weeks before our main fleet arrived, human ships started appearing throughout our supply lines. Not to fight pitched battles, but to strike and vanish like ghosts. They hit our fuel depots, our ammunition carriers, our medical transports. The commander's voice grew distant as memories overwhelmed him. I was aboard the supply vessel Kethmoran when they found us. We were carrying medical supplies to the front lines, clearly marked with the universal symbol for humanitarian aid. Every civilized species respects medical vessels. Humans attacked a medical ship? The shock in the young officer's voice was genuine. No, Zexhai said quietly. They did something worse. They disabled our engines with surgical precision, boarded us, and took everything. But they didn't harm the medical staff. Instead, they left behind some of their own wounded. Their enemies. They expected us to heal humans who had just robbed us. The absurdity of it hung in the air like smoke. No military strategist in the galaxy would understand such behavior. The psychological warfare was devastating. Our soldiers didn't know what to expect anymore. Were humans ruthless killers or honorable warriors? Would they show mercy or fight to the death? The uncertainty ate away at morale faster than any weapon could. Zexhai stood again, this time moving to lean against the wall. His scarred carapace caught the light, revealing damage patterns that spoke of close combat. When our main fleet finally reached Earth's solar system, we found them waiting, not hiding behind their planet's defenses as any sensible species would do. They had moved their entire fleet to the edge of their system, as far from their homeworld as possible. That makes no strategic sense, protested one of the listeners. They gave up all their defensive advantages. Unless, Zexhai said slowly, you understand that they weren't trying to defend anything. They were making sure the fight happened where they wanted it, not where we wanted it. They forced us to fight on their terms from the very beginning. The veteran's eyes grew distant again. The battle lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of the most brutal, chaotic fighting I've ever witnessed. Human ships would link together in combat, sharing power and weapon systems. When one was destroyed, others would immediately move to take its place in the formation. But that's just basic squadron tactics, another officer interjected. No, you're not listening. They weren't just maintaining formation. They were creating a living organism out of their fleet. Each ship became a cell in a larger creature that adapted and evolved during the fight. When we destroyed their long-range weapons, they moved in close. When we adapted to their close combat, they rammed us. When ramming stopped working, individual humans started crossing space in pressure suits to board our vessels directly. The cantina's atmosphere had grown thick with tension. Several other patrons had openly turned to listen to the veteran's account. I saw humans fighting in hard vacuum with nothing but magnetic boots and handheld weapons. They would tear holes in our hull, flood our ships with their boarding parties, and fight corridor to corridor until they reached our vital systems. And when our soldiers tried to surrender, they found that humans had no standard protocol for accepting it during active combat. Zexhai's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Because to a human mind, once the hunt has begun, It doesn't end until the prey stops running. And we kept running, kept fighting, so they kept hunting. How did you survive? The question came from someone at another table, the conversation having drawn a crowd. I was lucky, Zexhai replied, though his tone suggested he might not consider it luck. My ship was disabled early in the fight. Life support was failing, and I was trapped in a section that was venting atmosphere. I should have died. The veteran paused, his compound eyes reflecting the memory. A human found me. A female, barely larger than our youngest cadets. She was wearing a damaged pressure suit and carrying weapons that were older than some of our ships. She could have killed me easily. But she saved you instead? She did something that still confuses me to this day. She looked at me, broken and dying, and made a choice. She shared her oxygen with me, sealed the breach in my section with some kind of emergency foam, and left medical supplies before moving on to continue her hunt. The silence that followed was profound. Every species in the galaxy had some concept of honor or mercy, but this was different. This was something beyond their understanding. That's when I realized that humans weren't just predators. They were something far more dangerous. They were predators with conscience, hunters who could choose mercy in the middle of a battle, warriors who could switch between absolute brutality and unexpected kindness in the span of seconds. And that makes them more dangerous? It makes them unpredictable. And, in warfare, unpredictability is the greatest weapon of all. The crowd in the cantina had grown larger, with beings from a dozen species now gathered to hear Zexhai's account. Word had spread through the station that a veteran of the human wars was sharing his story, something that happened rarely enough to draw attention from across the galaxy. After the battle, Zexhai continued, I spent 3 months in a human medical facility while my injuries healed. They could have interrogated me, used me as a bargaining chip, or simply eliminated a potential future threat. Instead, they treated me better than some of our own military hospitals would have. A Thalaxian trader leaning against the bar spoke up, her crystalline voice ringing clearly. Perhaps they were simply trying to win you over with propaganda. Zexhai shook his head slowly. That's what I thought at first. But I observed them carefully during my recovery. The medical staff worked 20-hour shifts treating both human and alien wounded without distinction. They shared their limited supplies equally, and when food became scarce, the human staff ate less so that patients could maintain their strength. But that's just basic medical ethics, protested Lieutenant Veltar. Any civilized species would do the same. Would they? Zexhai challenged. When your homeworld is under attack, when your families are dying, when your entire species faces extinction, would you still share your last meal with an enemy soldier? Would you use your precious medical supplies to save the life of someone who came to destroy everything you love? The question hung in the air without an answer because everyone present knew the truth. No species they knew would make that choice consistently, not when survival was at stake. I watched them prepare for what they knew would be the final assault on their homeworld. Our combined fleet had regrouped with reinforcements from 3 other species. 800 ships surrounded Earth, enough firepower to crack continents. And still, the humans refused to surrender. Zexhai moved to the center of the room, his presence commanding attention from every being present. They did something that military historians are still trying to understand. They evacuated their non-combatants not to safety, but to other worlds where they could continue fighting if Earth fell. That's impossible, gasped a young Zilani engineer. No species has the transport capacity to move billions of civilians during an active siege. Humans don't think in terms of transport capacity. They think in terms of necessity. They converted every available ship, from massive cargo haulers to single-person racing craft. They stripped out everything non-essential and packed in as many people as possible. Children, elderly, artists, teachers, anyone who couldn't contribute directly to the defense. The veteran's scarred face reflected the cantina's lighting strangely, making his expression almost alien even to other aliens. But here's what made it truly terrifying. They weren't evacuating people to save lives. They were ensuring that human civilization would survive to continue the war even if Earth was completely destroyed. They were planning for total defeat while preparing for total victory, whispered the Thalaxian trader, her crystalline features reflecting understanding and horror in equal measure. Exactly. And That's when I began to comprehend what we were really fighting. Not just a species, but an idea. The idea that some things are worth dying for, and that death in service of those ideas is preferable to survival without them. Zexhai paused to take another drink, noting that his audience had grown to include nearly everyone in the cantina. Even the automated serving units seemed to have slowed their movements to avoid interrupting his narrative. The final battle lasted 3 days. 3 days of continuous combat, while our forces tried to break through Earth's defenses. But the humans had learned from every previous engagement. They had studied our tactics, our weapons, our psychology. They knew us better than we knew ourselves. "How could a primitive species analyze your military doctrines so quickly?" asked a Corvan officer whose rank insignia marked him as a tactical specialist. "Because they're natural pattern hunters. On their homeworld, they hunted prey that was faster, stronger, and better armed than they were. They survived by learning to read behavior, predict movement, and exploit weaknesses. They applied those same skills to warfare on a galactic scale." The veteran's voice grew heavy with remembered exhaustion. "They hit us with attacks that shouldn't have been possible. Weapons fired in sequences that overloaded our defensive systems. Ships that appeared from directions where no ships should have been able to approach. Tactics that violated every principle of space combat we had developed over millennia." "What do you mean?" "For example, they would accelerate toward our formations at maximum velocity, then shut down their engines and coast. Our sensors would lose track of the powerless ships in the chaos of battle. By the time we detected them again, they were already inside our defensive perimeter, firing at point-blank range." The tactical specialist made a note on his personal device, his expression troubled. That maneuver would require incredible precision and timing. It would also require absolute trust between crew members and willingness to accept massive casualties if the timing was even slightly off. Human pilots would thread through our crossfire with centimeters to spare, trusting their wingmates to provide covering fire at exactly the right moments. Zexhai gestured to his prosthetic leg. "I lost this limb when a human fighter pilot deliberately crashed into our command bridge. He could have ejected safely, but he chose to stay with his ship to ensure maximum damage. As his fighter disintegrated around him, he was still firing his sidearm through the cockpit glass." "That's not military strategy," protested someone from the back of the crowd. "That's madness." "Is it? Or is it the logical extension of a hunting mindset applied to technological warfare? When a human pack hunted a mammoth on their homeworld, individual hunters would risk everything to bring down prey that could feed the entire tribe. The risk to one was always acceptable if it meant survival for many." The veteran's words were having a visible effect on his audience. Several of the younger officers looked physically ill, while older beings nodded grimly as they recognized the implications. "But we had superior numbers, superior technology, superior training. How could they possibly win?" Zexhai's laugh was bitter and tired. "We had everything except the one thing that mattered most. We had logic, strategy, and overwhelming force. But humans had something we couldn't match and couldn't understand." He paused, looking around the room at faces representing dozens of species, all waiting for his answer. They had the absolute certainty that they were fighting for something worth dying for, and that certainty made them more dangerous than any weapon we possessed. The cantina had become so quiet that the hum of the station's life support systems seemed unnaturally loud. Zexhai stood in the center of the room, his scarred form commanding the attention of every being present. The weight of his next words seemed to press down on the assembled crowd like the gravity of a dying star. On the 3rd day of the siege, something changed. Our fleet commanders had expected the human resistance to weaken as their losses mounted. Instead, they seemed to grow stronger, more coordinated, more desperate. That's when we received intelligence that explained everything. The veteran paused, his compound eyes reflecting memories that still haunted his sleep cycles. The humans had discovered our true objective. We weren't just trying to conquer Earth. The Alliance planned to harvest their entire species for genetic experimentation and slave labor. Every man, woman, and child would be processed through xenobiology facilities. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Even among species accustomed to warfare, such plans were considered extreme. Until that moment, humans had been fighting to defend their territory, their independence, their way of life. Suddenly, they were fighting for their very existence as a species, and that transformed them from dangerous predators into something far worse. "What could be worse than what you've already described?" whispered Lieutenant Veltar, his voice barely audible. "Predators with nothing left to lose," Zexhai replied simply. "When a human pack is cornered with no possibility of escape, they don't surrender or negotiate. They enter what their military calls berserker state. Every restraint, every tactical consideration, every concern for self-preservation vanishes. They become pure hunters focused on taking as many enemies with them as possible." The veteran moved closer to his young officers, his prosthetic leg whirring softly with each step. "I witnessed the moment when Earth's entire population received the news of our intentions. Every human military unit, every civilian defense force, every individual capable of holding a weapon made the same decision simultaneously. They would make our victory so costly that other species would think twice before attempting similar campaigns. But surely they couldn't coordinate such a response across an entire planet during active combat," protested the tactical specialist. "You're thinking like a civilized being again," Zexhai said with something approaching pity. "Humans don't need formal communication networks when survival is at stake. They have what they call hive mind intuition. When one human pack realizes they're facing extinction, somehow every other pack knows it too. It's like their entire species becomes a single organism focused on one goal." The Thalaxian trader's crystalline features reflected the cantina's lights as she leaned forward. "You're describing impossible coordination without technological support. I'm describing evolution. For millions of years on their homeworld, human tribal groups faced extinction events regularly. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, predator invasions, disease outbreaks. The groups that survived were those who could organize instantly in crisis situations without waiting for orders from leaders who might already be dead." Zexhai's voice grew distant as he continued. "During the final 18 hours of the siege, human civilians began launching themselves at our ships in personal spacecraft never designed for combat. Teachers, doctors, children barely old enough to operate the controls, elderly beings who should have been in medical care. All of them choosing death over capture. That's not military resistance," someone called out. "That's species suicide." "No, it was species preservation through proxy revenge. Every civilian who died taking out one of our ships was ensuring that fewer of our forces would survive to threaten other human colonies. They were buying time and reducing our capabilities at the cost of their own lives." The veteran gestured to his scarred carapace, touching damage that had never fully healed. "I received these wounds when a human child, barely into adolescence, detonated an improvised explosive device in our forward command post. She walked past our security sensors because she was obviously non-combatant, obviously harmless, obviously someone we should protect rather than fear." "A child soldier?" The horror in the young officer's voice was unmistakable. "Not a soldier. A volunteer. She made the choice herself, without orders, without training, without understanding military strategy. She simply recognized that her death could save others and accepted that trade without hesitation." The silence that followed this revelation was different from the earlier quiet. This was the silence of beings confronting something that challenged their fundamental understanding of rational behavior. "How can any species function when individuals make such choices?" asked the Zalani engineer, her technical mind struggling to process the concept. "That's what makes humans the apex predators of the galaxy," Zexhai explained. "Most species develop civilization by learning to suppress individual impulses for the good of the group. Humans developed civilization by learning to channel individual sacrifice for the survival of the entire species." The veteran looked around the room, noting how many beings had unconsciously stepped back from him as his story progressed. Fear was a healthy response to what he was describing. By the end of the third day, our fleet had lost over 60% of its ships. Earth's surface was scarred and burning, but the human resistance hadn't broken. Instead, it had spread. Other human colonies throughout their local systems had declared war on the entire alliance. Cargo ships were being converted into weapons platforms. Mining stations were producing improvised warheads. Scientific research facilities were developing new ways to kill us. But You must have had contingency plans for extended resistance, protested the tactical specialist. Our contingency plans assumed that prolonged warfare would weaken enemy resolve as casualties mounted and resources were depleted. Human psychology works in reverse. The longer they fight, the more committed they become. Every loss makes them angrier, more focused, more willing to sacrifice everything for victory. Zexhai returned to his original seat, his movements betraying the exhaustion that came with reliving traumatic memories. That's when the Alliance leadership finally understood what we were facing. We weren't fighting a standard military campaign against another spacefaring species. We were trying to exterminate a species that had evolved to treat extinction as just another hunting challenge. What happened next? The question came from multiple voices simultaneously. The Alliance made the only rational decision possible under the circumstances, Zexhai said quietly. We retreated, not a strategic withdrawal or a tactical repositioning. We fled like prey animals with predators on our trail. You abandoned the invasion? We abandoned the entire sector. Every ship that could still achieve faster-than-light travel was ordered to evacuate immediately. We left behind damaged vessels, wounded personnel, and millions of credits worth of military equipment. The Alliance Council declared that the Sol system and all adjacent systems were to be considered permanently off-limits to all member species. The veterans' words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. The implications were staggering. You're telling us that the most powerful military alliance in the galaxy was defeated by a single primitive world. I'm telling you that we discovered something more important than victory or defeat. We learned that there are some species in the universe that cannot be conquered, cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be safely ignored. Humans are one of those species. The aftermath of Zexhai's revelations settled over the cantina like a heavy fog. Beings from across the galaxy sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they had heard. The veteran remained seated, his scarred form a living reminder of humanity's capacity for violence. That was 20 years ago, Zexhai continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Since then, humans have spread throughout the galaxy, not as conquerors, but as something far more unsettling. They've become the species that others call when the situation is truly hopeless. Lieutenant Veltar found his voice first. What do you mean? Remember the vegan plague outbreak 7 years ago? When the disease was killing entire worlds and no medical science could stop it? The Galactic Health Council contacted Earth. Human researchers worked in contaminated areas without full protective gear, exposing themselves to lethal pathogens to gather data faster. The Zalani engineers' crystalline features reflected confusion. That's not just dangerous, it's completely irrational. Why would they take such risks? Because to humans, the risk to individuals was acceptable if it meant saving entire populations. They developed a cure in 6 months that our best scientists said would take decades. The cost was 43 human researchers who died from exposure. But they saved billions of lives across dozens of worlds. Zexhai stood slowly, moving to the viewport once again. Outside, the peaceful traffic of interstellar commerce continued its eternal dance, ships from hundreds of species trading and traveling in relative harmony. Or consider the Andromedan border crisis. When the extragalactic invaders established their beachhead in the Kepler system, every military analysis concluded that the sector was lost. The Alliance fleet was ordered to establish a containment perimeter and wait for reinforcements that would take months to arrive. I remember that, said the Thalaxian trader. The invasion force was eventually repelled, but the reports were classified. The reports were classified because they contained information that would have caused panic throughout the galaxy. Earth's government offered to send a single human fleet to deal with the invasion. 100 ships against an enemy force that had already destroyed 3 Alliance battle groups. The veterans' compound eyes reflected the starlight streaming through the viewport. The human fleet didn't engage in conventional combat. Instead, they studied the invaders' technology, learned their tactics, and adapted their own equipment in real time during battle. When their weapons proved ineffective, they rammed enemy vessels. When ramming failed, they used their ships as delivery systems for boarding parties. 100 ships couldn't possibly defeat a force that size, protested the tactical specialist. You're right. 100 ships couldn't defeat them. But 100 ships full of humans could force the invaders to make a choice: commit their entire fleet to destroying the human force, or watch as humans learned enough about their technology to eventually defeat them. The invaders chose to retreat rather than risk teaching humans how to build extragalactic warships. The implications of this statement rippled through the crowd like a shock wave. An enemy force powerful enough to threaten the entire galaxy had chosen to flee rather than risk prolonged contact with a single human fleet. That's when I finally understood what humans really are, Zexhai said, turning back to face his audience. They're not just predators or warriors or survivors. They're evolutionary weapons designed by a universe that occasionally produces species capable of solving any problem by refusing to accept that the problem cannot be solved. But surely there must be limits to what they can accomplish, insisted Lieutenant Veltar, his voice betraying desperation to maintain some rational framework for understanding. 3 years ago, the research station at Proxima Centauri detected signals from what appeared to be a dormant machine intelligence, something left behind by a species that had transcended physical existence millions of years ago. The artificial mind was beyond anything our technology could comprehend, but it was clearly hostile to organic life. Zexhai returned to his seat one final time, his prosthetic leg settling with a soft hiss. The station was evacuated except for a small team of researchers who volunteered to study the entity before it could fully activate. 12 beings from 7 species, working around the clock to understand technology that was literally beyond their comprehension. And humans were part of this research team. Humans were the research team. The other species provided support, but the actual interaction with the machine intelligence was handled entirely by human researchers. Because humans are the only species in the galaxy that can look at something infinitely more advanced than themselves and immediately start planning how to communicate with it, learn from it, or if necessary, destroy it. The cantina had become a pocket of perfect silence in the bustling station. Even the background noise of ventilation systems and distant conversations seemed muted. The entity was successfully contained, though the details remained classified at levels above my clearance. What I can tell you is that the human research team emerged from the experience fundamentally changed. Not traumatized or broken, but enhanced. They had somehow learned to interface directly with technology that predated their species by millions of years. That's impossible, breathed the Zilani engineer. No organic mind could process information at those levels. Impossible for every other species we know. Routine for humans. Because they're the species that looks at impossible problems and treats them as interesting puzzles to be solved through application of intelligence, creativity, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. Zexhai finished the last of his drink, setting the glass down with deliberate care. This is why I warn everyone who will listen. Humans are not just another spacefaring species. They're the apex predators of intelligence itself. They hunt problems that other species can't even recognize, and they don't stop until either the problem is solved or they're dead. But they seem peaceful enough in normal interactions, observed the Thalaxian trader. I've done business with humans before, and they were quite reasonable. Humans are perfectly peaceful as long as they don't perceive a threat to something they consider important. The problem is that humans consider almost everything important. Their families, their friends, their principles, their freedom, other species they've never met, concepts they learned about in school, abstract philosophical ideals they can't even properly define. The veteran stood for the final time, his battle-scarred form casting long shadows in the dim lighting. My advice to all of you is simple. If you encounter humans in your travels, treat them with the respect you would show to any apex predator. Don't threaten them, don't challenge them, and don't assume that their friendly behavior means they're harmless. And if conflict with them becomes unavoidable, asked Lieutenant Veltar. Zexhai's expression carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom and barely healed trauma. Then, you should hope that whatever you're fighting for is worth dying for, because humans will keep coming until either you're dead, they're dead, or they've found a way to turn you into an ally. Remember this above all else. Humans are not just warriors or survivors or problem solvers. They're the species that evolution produced when a world needed beings capable of turning any challenge into a hunting opportunity. And now they're loose in the galaxy, looking for new problems to solve. The veteran moved toward the cantina's exit, his prosthetic leg marking time with mechanical precision. The war taught me many things, but the most important lesson was this. In a universe full of intelligent species, humans are the ones who look at intelligence itself as just another tool for hunting. And everything else in the galaxy is potentially prey. As Zexhai disappeared into the station's corridors, the beings in the cantina slowly began to disperse, each carrying with them a new understanding of humanity's place in the cosmic order. The conversations that followed would spread throughout the galaxy, carrying a simple message. Humans were not just another species to be cataloged and understood. They were the hunters who had learned to hunt the very concept of impossibility itself, and that made them the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered.